Hello everyone. Welcome to Facebook Live Challenge, innovative innovation by the Anesthetists Society. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the hard work and the planning of our beloved Bhai, Ethel Bhai, for taking a keen initiative and planning each and every lecture that is being telecasted for the betterment and uplifting of this society. And also thank all the office bearers and those who are behind this initiative, who are doing the background and the backbone work of this special initiative. Today's topic is blood component therapy and overview. I am Dr. Surendranath, working as a consultant anesthesiologist at SIMS Hospital, Chennai. So before I start the main lecture as such, I would like to, hello everyone, claim that welcome to Facebook Live Challenge. I am an anesthesiologist and I am not a transfusion specialist. I have explained it in a fashion for a basic understanding in between giving you the updates in the transfusion medicine. I leave it to your discretion to apply it clinically. And I do not support any pharmaceutical company by quoting their name in the lecture. So, overview, the blood group system, mainly I would like to touch upon the ABO or RH system, the component separation process, a view on components and its indications, a note on stored blood changes, a review on massive transfusion protocol. I'll touch upon complication of transfusion and what is patient blood management. So we all know globally 50% of the total transfusion happening in the world is done by anesthesiologists. So you and me are one of the main user of transfusion medicine as such for surgery. And it is very important for us to know about the basic signs of transfusion and the complication associated. Blood is considered as a liquid organ and any transfusion should be taken with utmost care. Any transfusion of blood or blood products should be considered as transplanting because we are going to expose our patient to a new antigen and there is high possibility for any antigen antibody reaction to occur. And the world started with blood transfusion from World War I, II, and it went to component therapy between 1960s and 1970s because the availability of blood became very short and people required particular component for their medical condition. So we changed from whole blood transfusion to component therapy. It went on for 3 to 5 decades till now, and there is another revisiting of whole blood. So we'll just see the recent advances in usage of whole blood. We all know globally there is always a short supply of blood availability and component availability. Maintaining blood bank is a very costly affair, be it infrastructure, staffing, and the preparation and the backbone. Everything requires huge investment. And backbone of transfusion is the blood bank. The blood bank officer who controls it is the main determinant of transfusion medicine in particular institution. So before we go to the main topic, I would like to share with you some lifetime experiences of transfusion in my practice. So case scenario 1. So me and my friend, we were just, she was on duty and I was leaving home. So she said, I received a call from ER, just have a look before you go home. So I packed my things and I went along with her to my ER. where we assessed a 23-year-old primigravida twin pregnancy, and she had a prolonged labor in other hospital, almost 24 to 36 hours of prolonged labor. I do not know why in twins they waited so long. Then she started bleeding and she was shifted in the last minute for want of blood bank in the other hospital. It was a weekend, so it is more likely that we get such patient shifted to tertiary care. On arrival, we saw her with heart rate of 140 per minute, blood pressure 90 systolic, and patient was literally gasping both with pain and she was really tired. A massive transfusion was done with 4 units of PRCs, 4 units of FFPs, 4 units of cryoprecipitate. This is what we could get that time. And she was given 2 grams of tranexamic acid on arrival. IV fluid of 2 liters of crystalloids and colloids were pushed on all sides. Through a large bore IV line, invasive blood pressure was placed. She was taken to theater, immediately delivered with emergent LSCS. And she was stabilized both intra-op and she was stabilized in post-op in PACU. Case scenario 2. This is when me and my friend were doing a case together, a 57-year-old male, diabetic, hypertensive, and smoker. He was undergoing VATS, minimally invasive thoracic surgery for lobectomy. Lobectomy was being done for CA lung. During dissection, the main pulmonary branch was injured. The senior surgeon who was operating, we were lucky to have a senior surgeon because he opened the chest within less than 1 minute with a flash thoracotomy before we could realize. In the meantime, we lost approximately 1 to 1.5 liters in that 1 minute, which was very essential for saving the patient. And the vitals dropped from 130 to 100 to 50. This was the 3 readings in 1 minute. So by the time we could resuscitate with crystalloid, we ordered for 4 units of PRCs and FFPs, and products arrived as soon as possible. At least the PRCs came first, FFPs took at least half an hour to reach. Pulmonary artery was taken care and it was controlled, surgery finished, and patient was stabilized. He was extubated the next day. Case scenario 3. A 56-year-old female, CA ovary, staging laparotomy was done for a huge mass, which is approximately 30-week gravida uterus. She received 3 units of blood, which was given intraoperatively, 4 units of FFP, and she received 3 liters of crystalloids for 1.5 liters blood loss. The surgery took almost 6 hours. Our oncosurgeon was very meticulous, and he took almost 6 hours to complete the surgery. It was a huge mass to start with. Stable hemodynamics. She was shifted with stable hemodynamics to PACU. Suddenly, she developed hypotension and a DIC-like scenario because the drain started pouring more than 150 ml per hour. TEG was done, transfused with 3 units of PRCs again, 6 units of FFP, 4 platelets, and pro cryo. Simultaneously, acidosis correction. She was on tube, so we were able to hyperventilate, started on infusion of bicarbonate. Calcium was replaced, forced warming blanket was placed, and ultimately that patient survived. There was 3 case scenarios which I had explained to you. One is a preoperative stabilization leading to surgery. The second is the intraoperative catastrophe. And the third scenario is a postoperative care. If you see in the case 1, there was an adequate infrastructure. We had a good multidisciplinary teamwork, and we had good blood bank support. The second scenario where we had an intraoperative collapse, experienced surgeon mattered much, and we were team of 2. So 1 plus 1 was not 2 there, it is 1 plus 1 is equal to 11. And a strong blood bank support again. Third case, which is a post-operative problem, and we had improved vigilance and monitoring. Point of care investigation like TEG was available, and again, a good blood bank support. So if you see in the 3 scenario, the thread which binds these 3 is good blood bank support. So every credit of saving a patient with a massive bleeding in an hospital should be given to blood bank as it is claimed by the clinicians. What is the aim of blood transfusion? I should say intravascular volume expansion. This is a very common statement and everybody would agree with me, but to our dismay, this is not the true which we encounter in a clinical scenario. Intravascular volume expansion is not the primary goal of blood transfusion. I would like to stress this point. The main aim is to improve oxygen delivery. That is the most important function of blood transfusion. If you see the physiological basis, the arterial oxygen content is determined by three factors. Number one, hemoglobin. Number two, the oxygen saturation. And number three, the partial pressure of oxygen. Hemoglobin, if there is a sudden fall or in hemoglobin due to acute anemia due to bleeding, it can fall by at least 30 to 40%. But if we can improve the partial pressure, you can give hyperoxic mixture, then you can sustain to certain extent, because the normal value is between 17 to 20 ml per deciliter, which is delivered to the patient. We can sustain the patient life to certain extent. And the delivery of oxygen depends on the product of cardiac output and the arterial oxygen content. So if you want to raise cardiac output, you don't require blood. You require only crystalloids or colloids. That is more than enough. But if you want to deliver oxygen, you need hemoglobin, for which you will require PRBCs. Other things are in our control, which is not dependent on the blood product which you are going to receive. The normal value being, the normal oxygen delivery value being between 750 to 1200 ml per minute. And I would say it is more luxurious because we require only 200 to 250 ml per minute. So God gives a big margin of safety here. So the other aim is maintain hemostasis and aid tissue metabolism. We do not want any anaerobic metabolism. Should we aim only to correct the hemoglobin value whenever we plan blood transfusion? No. We should look into the complete clinical scenario, as with you have to take hemodynamic into consideration. You have to look into the end organ perfusion and what is the anticipated surgical need. Suppose if I have a huge mass to come out and I have a hemoglobin of 9 and it is I have already see 1.5 liters in my suction can, I need more blood. But if I see the surgeon is already closing the abdomen and I do not require any, I don't anticipate any surgical need, you can stop transfusing blood for a hemoglobin of 9. So hemoglobin should not be the only value to determine blood transfusion. Humans by nature have got tolerance of to tolerate anemia or dilutional anemia to a large extent. When we do a surgery, we give a lot of crystalloids, colloids. So that leads to hemodilution. So we aim at normovolumic hemodilution, and it's tolerated down to a very low hemoglobin in a normal patient or a normal person. He can go down up to 3 grams per deciliter hemoglobin, and he can still survive. And though mortality may be increased in comparison to the normal population, but he can still survive. He can still survive without any risk for tissue perfusion, any risk for tissue oxygenation or end organ damage. There is a large natural anemia tolerance in the human body. If you take this graph, this y-axis, this is the oxygen delivery and this is the oxygen consumption, represented as VO2. If you take us in the point 1, that is in normal oxygen delivery at normal consumption, this is around 1000 ml per minute. That's what we saw. Suppose if the patient starts bleeding, he will have the point 1 shifted to point 2. Still, the oxygen consumption is, the demand is met with the supply. Then if you have a continued bleeding and you have a normovolumic hemodilution occurring, you are maintaining the cardiac output with the help of IV fluids, then you will be pushed to point 3. This is a critical point. Okay, this is a critical point where you have a critical hemoglobin, critical hematocrit, and critical delivery of oxygen, beyond which you will see the consumption being not met with. The demand goes up, but the supply reduces. So the tissue goes for hypoxia and shifts from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, and they go for lactic acidosis and ultimately leading to death. So there is a large margin of safety, around 70 to 75%, almost like 3 to 4-fold. The God has given us to make mistakes, and we can use this margin to save patient from any blood transfusion and your timely action. So we'll go to the blood group. Blood group is nothing but it is determined by expression of distinct antigen on RBC cell surface. There are more than 30 common antigens and more than 100 uncommon antigens which we know of till date. These antigens are genetically controlled and they are passed on from generation to generation. The most common system which we know is ABO system and rhesus system, that is RH system. Antigens define compatible transfusion. Okay, so it is very important we understand this antigen antibody interplay. Antigens are agglutinogens, they are also known as agglutinogens. Antibodies are known as agglutinins. There are various other blood group system, that is MNS, the Lutheran, Lewis, the Kell, Kidd, Lee, everything, Duffy, Diego, Bombay system, everything. And it was in 1901 when Karl Landsteiner defined or described this ABO system, and he successfully transfused in many patients by understanding the antigenic interplay, for which he was awarded Nobel Prize in 1930. Though it was delayed, it was apt. So this is the antigen expression of RBC surface. You have got the ABO system, you have got the RH system. This is the only thing which we know. But other than this, there are a lot of antigen systems which are expressed on the cell surface as a polysaccharide chains. Okay, you have the Kell system, the Duffy system, Lutheran, everything expressed on the RBC. Suppose if you give such RBC into a patient, from one donor to the recipient, we look only for ABO compatibility and RH compatibility, because 98% of transfusions can be successfully performed if we know RH and ABO compatibility. That's why this system is very important. So the ABO blood group is defined by the expression of antigen A and antigen B on the RBCs. So if you take a type A blood group, they express antigen A and they have anti-B antibodies in the plasma. Type B, they express antigen B on the cell surface and they have anti-A antibodies in the plasma. Type AB, they have antigen A and B expressed on the cell surface and they have no plasma antibodies because they have both antigens on the cell. Type O, they don't express any of them and they have anti-A and anti-B in the plasma. This is very important because any cell from A, if it is transfused to type O, the anti-A will go and destroy or hemolyze the RBC. So this is very important. We give compatible ABO blood to patients. These antibodies, they are seen, though they are seen at birth, but the titers are very low. But as it expresses after 8 or 9 months onwards. It peaks by age 8 and 10 and it is present throughout life. Mainly these natural antibodies are gained by the food we eat and exposure to the bacteria which mimic these antigens, and hence we develop antibodies to the antigen which is not present in the RBC. RH system is different from ABO to the extent that it is exclusively present on RBCs alone. And it is not seen in any other bacteria or virus. So it is exclusively seen on the RBC. there are three antigens, C, D, and E, but the major compatibility issues comes with D. So, and they express very well on the RBC cell surface. The difference between ABO reaction and RH system is that in ABO, we already have the antibody in us. So if you expose these RBCs into the patient, they can immediately hemolyze. But RH system needs sensitization. I should, suppose I am a negative RH negative system fellow, and I need first to get sensitized with RH positive RBCs. So in the next transfusion, if I receive any blood cells, which is RH negative, then I will react, cross react. So on the basis of presence of RH system dominant or recessive, then it is divided as positive or negative. So if you see the blood compatibility, ABO group O can donate to O, A, B, and AB. A can donate to A and AB. B can donate it to B and AB. AB can donate only to AB, mainly because of it is dictated by the presence of antibodies in the plasma. But if you see the recipient side, sorry, that's why the O is known as universal donor, because he can donate it to O, A, B, and AB groups. All four groups can be donated with RBCs of O group. The universal recipient is AB. He can receive blood from O, A, B, and AB because he doesn't have any antibody in his plasma. So he will not lyse any blood cells which has been transfused into him. But if you give any blood cell other than O, he will hemolyze. So O cannot receive blood from anyone other than O, and AB can receive blood from anyone. But this is not the case in the plasma. The fresh frozen plasma which we give, AB doesn't express any antibody in the plasma. So he becomes universal donor for fresh frozen plasma. If you see here, he can donate it to blood group A, B, AB, and O. But O can receive only from, and he can receive it from anybody because here he doesn't express any antigen. So plasma from O, AB, A, and B can be transfused to O group. Okay. Compatibility testing. So ABO RH typing requires compatibility testing. It is taken up in the blood bank before the blood is issued. And the plasma of both donor and recipient undergoes antibody screening. And then a mini blood transfusion is being done with a test tube for cross match. That is known as cross match. So in an emergency, only ABO RH type specific blood transfusion is more than sufficient. They don't look for other antibodies, allo antibodies present in the plasma, or neither a cross match is done. A full cross match will take almost 45 minutes to 60 minutes. So in an emergency situation, ABO RH type specific is more than sufficient. You have to remember 15% of the transfusion related death is mainly because of antibody incompatible hemolytic reaction. That is, any O cell can react with anti-A and anti-B. If you transfuse only with ABO RH typing alone, you can have a successful compatible transfusion of up to 99.8% of time. Okay. And if you add an antibody screening, you increase the compatibility rate to 99.94%. But if you want to do a cross match, you increase it very marginally to 99.95. So you should remember, anytime we don't have 100% compatible transfusion. We have only 99.95 even in a completely cross-matched blood. So whenever you give a blood, start it very slow, allow initial 10 to 25 ml to go very slowly, and then you can increase the speed. Because you do not know, your patient may fall into that 0.05%. So component therapy, as we saw, there was a paradigm change in 1960 to 1970s. the essential component transfusion was only given to those who have hemophilia. Okay, they received only the factor transfusion. So that saved many people, and they increase the availability of blood products globally. But it requires a lot of infrastructure and investment because we need a perfect storage facility and a component separation process. So people revisited, rethinking, and reassurance was given to component therapy. So this we already saw. If it is a type and screen, only ABO-RH typing is done and antibody testing is done. If it is a complete cross match, it will take the donor cells, red cells are mixed with patient serum to see complete cross match. It's a cross match is a 3-stage process. It will take 45 to 60 minutes. They usually use indirect antiglobulin test. That is the patient serum, the recipient serum, and the reagent erythrocytes are mixed, and then anti-human globulin, that is anti-IgG, is added. If it agglutinates, then it is considered positive. So this is how the major cross match occurs. Patient serum is added with the donor RBC, incubated together for almost an hour, then centrifuge. You add 2 drops of anti-human globulin, okay, and then if it agglutinates, then the antigen antibody has reacted. So you do not transfuse this blood. If it doesn't agglutinate, then it is compatible. So basic composition of blood, you have 55% of plasma and 45% as blood cell components, of which 4% are white blood cells and platelets, remaining RBCs. This is the component separation process. You have the whole blood donated by the donor. In the first centrifuge, the packed cells separate. And if it is a rare blood group, they immediately freeze it to minus 80 degrees centigrade and keep it as stored as frozen red cells. And it can be stored up to 10 years. The shelf life is 10 years. But when it is thawed, you add glycerol to it to thaw it, and then you have to transfuse it within a day. You have to use it within a day. Some RBCs are kept as leukocyte poor RBCs or leukocyte depleted RBCs, because you may need to transfuse it to patients who are immunocompromised or those who have IgA deficiency. After centrifugal and packed cells are taken off, you have a platelet-rich plasma. And if you centrifuge it again, you will remove the platelets. And a platelet-poor plasma is obtained, which is frozen up to minus 20 degrees, and it is kept as or stored as fresh frozen plasma. Some banks freeze up to, they store it up to 1 year, and it is thawed before it is given to you. So if you want to have a fresh frozen plasma, you have to wait at least 20 to 30 minutes, and the blood bank will thaw the FFPs and then give it to you. But the platelets, the lifetime is only 5 to 7 days, and it is kept at below 20 degrees and with a gentle agitation. The fresh frozen plasma, when they are thawing, the precipitate which they obtain is the cryoprecipitate, and the remaining plasma is factor 8 poor plasma. This is how the components are separated step by step. So the first component which we are going to see is PRBC. Around 200 to 250 mL of PRBCs are filtered into packed red blood cells, and 60 to 70 mL of CPDA, it is the mixture which is added, where the citrate is the anticoagulant, which chelates with the calcium and make the blood non-coagulable. Phosphate is a buffer. Dextrose gives a substrate, energy substrate to the RBC to continue metabolism, and adenine is to regenerate ATPs, because ATPs will be used up for metabolism. So adenine replenishes ATPs in the stored RBCs. It is stored between 2 to 6 degrees, mainly to reduce the metabolism by 80%. So that RBC metabolism reduces by 80% at this temperature, and adding CPDA improves the shelf life from 35 to 42 days. So as such, if you see, there is insignificant plasma volume, around 10 ml or so. The main indication is to treat acute or chronic anemia. The main advantage of using PRBCs, packed red blood cell, is reduces volume overload. So any patient with congestive heart failure or renal failure or liver failure who is already loaded with volume, if you give PRBCs, you can have a significant improvement in hemoglobin without much increase in the volume. Usually they have to, it should be a compatible, ABO compatible transfusion. The characteristics of RBC, packed red blood cell, is the hematocrit of 55 to 65% is achieved by centrifuge method. The pH is a bit acidic. It's around 6 to 6.7, 6.8 to 6.9. And if you see the carbon dioxide, since the metabolism is continued in the RBCs, you see the carbon dioxide is raised. It's around 80. And the plastic bag doesn't allow the carbon dioxide to escape. But do not worry, if you transfuse even a packed red blood cell with a carbon dioxide of 80, it can be ventilated out very soon. The bicarbonate level falls significantly because of reduced pH. Sodium is 126 in the stored blood cells. And if you see, potassium is another important ingredient which increases as we keep storing, because the sodium potassium ATPase stop functioning. It stopped functioning, and the potassium is left behind. Glucose, this is the packed red blood cell characteristics in the stored RBCs in the blank. Compatibility with IV fluids. Suppose if you're running a parallel fluid along with the PRBC, a dextrose containing fluid can lead to a hypotonic mixture. And if you imagine, the dextrose will be used up by the RBCs for metabolism, and the free water which is present can enter into the RBCs and it can lyse the cell at 30 minutes at the room temperature. And another important thing is you cannot use it with ringer lactate, because the ringer lactate contains calcium and it can get clotted, because if it chelates with citrate, it can be clotted. Actual measurement of blood loss. If you ask an anesthetist to estimate the blood loss, it is usually we overestimate at least by 40 to 50%. So that is the biggest flaw in visual method. If you just see visually the pad, these gauze pieces, the suction bottle, then the estimation is overestimation. The next more ideal measurement is gravimetric. That is, you measure each gauze and pad, the dry weight and the wet weight, that is completely soaked pad and gauze. You subtract the dry weight, you get the absolute blood loss. The recent advances are the spectrophotometric finger measurement. It looks like a pulse oximeter on the finger, and if you just allow it to read the signals in your finger, it can give you estimated hemoglobin on the screen like a pulse oximeter. Though the margin of error is plus minus 1 to 1.5 gram deciliter hemoglobin, it is a continuous monitor. Suppose you are in a surgery where the hemoglobin falls from 13 to 11, then you have to look into the matter, what made the sudden change. In that way, it can be useful. But there are a lot of factors which affect the blood flow to the digit. So some people use digital block to maintain the blood flow. There are some app-based blood loss assessment apps, where if in a camera, you just show the soaked pad and gauze pieces, it can have, there is an algorithm to understand the picture on the basis of the color, and it gives an approximate blood loss. Other things are point of care invasive monitors like HemoQ or iStat, which is like a glucometer, where you can just drop, with a drop of blood, you can estimate the hemoglobin. So what are the targets when you manage such sudden acute bleeding in a surgery? So during hemorrhage, try to restore the intravascular volume using crystalloids and colloids. That is your main aim. This will maintain the normovolemia, though it will lead to hemodilution and dilution coagulopathy can occur, but you can start infusing crystalloid at least 1 to 2 liters initially to increase the volume or maintain normovolemia. That will ultimately maintain the cardiac output. Because once you maintain intravascular volume and cardiac output, there is a delivery of oxygen. That is, you increase the oxygen delivery and you maintain the organ perfusion to normal. But then you start, remember the graph which I told you, then you start coming on the graph and you have some problem in oxygen delivery. Then you need somebody to carry oxygen now. Then you transfuse with PRBC. So PRBC transfusion can be delayed much with use of crystalloids and colloids. So measurement and trend of vital sign is very important. You shouldn't have any patient who is persistently hypotensive or tachycardic. Assessment of blood loss, of anticipated blood loss is also very important. We have to determine hemoglobin concentration in between, and you have to understand the surgical concerns for additional transfusion. You can order 1 or 2 units initially, but how to order additional PRBCs requires understanding of the surgical situation. So what should be a preoperative transfusion strategy? Try to manage preoperative anemia at least by 3 to 4 weeks of oral therapy of iron, or if you are pressed with time, then you can go for IV ferrous iron therapy. Some patients, some centers use erythropoietin, but before giving erythropoietin, you have to remember you have to replenish the iron stores, then use erythropoietin. Then only you will have an effective improvement in the anemia. But you have to remember only one thing: whenever you are using erythropoietin, the thromboembolic phenomenon is reported to increase. Prophylactic PRBC transfusion. Okay, I have a hemoglobin of 7 for a lady with who is scheduled for an elective surgery. I will admit her and I will give 1 or 2 units of PRBCs before the surgery. It's a strict no. This is a very time tested, or many people who are practicing for a long time, they have a tendency, any surgeon, okay sir, we'll just admit and give 1 unit of PRBC and take him up for surgery tomorrow. No, try to avoid such situation, and blood transfusion, even a single unit, should be taken with a pinch of salt. Now comes liberal versus restrictive transfusion. Liberal transfusion is you have to aim to give, your trigger is between 9 to 10 grams per deciliter, below which you will start giving RBCs. Restrictive is you will wait till 7 to 8 grams of deciliter of hemoglobin to transfuse. A lot of studies have been done to compare the restrictive strategy and the liberal strategy. The outcome is mortality is almost the same. It's not different from restrictive and liberal. So why not use restrictive transfusion of RBCs? And another thing is there is no increased hospital stay of those who receive restrictive strategy for transfusion, and there is no increased wound infection. There is no increased morbidity, other morbidity associated with restrictive transfusion. Even in a patient who is critically ill, they require careful assessment of clinical situation. That is, if there is an end oxygen delivery collapse, then only they go for transfusion. Otherwise, even a restrictive transfusion of 7 to 8 grams per deciliter is acceptable even in critically ill patient. But one size fits all phenomenon cannot be used, but you need a context-specific approach. So this study, or this review meta-analysis, which assessed the impact of preoperative erythropoietin on blood transfusion surgical patient, mainly they looked into cardiovascular and cardiothoracic and orthopedic surgeries. And in their analysis, they found that blood transfusion, we all know that it is associated with increased infection, thrombotic complication, and mortality, which is associated with blood transfusion. So this meta-analysis compared 32 RCTs, and almost equal number of patients received pre-op erythropoietin and a placebo. But if you see, the pre-op erythropoietin significantly decreased blood transfusion, though the thrombotic complications are there with erythropoietin. With the modern usage of low molecular weight heparin post-op and early ambulation in enhanced recovery after surgery program pathway, it reduces the incidence of DVT or other thromboembolic phenomena. So erythropoietin usage should be encouraged. So if you see the recommendation for PRBC transfusion, so don't transfuse for more than 10 grams per deciliter, absolutely no. For any hemoglobin of less than 7 or 6, a restrictive transfusion strategy, especially when the anemia is acute, absolutely yes. A restriction strategy for less than 8 grams per deciliter should be employed. Multimodal protocols and algorithms should be employed to reduce intraoperative blood loss and transfusion requirements by using oral ferrous therapy. And you should use point of care testing for a direct care. Usage of single hemoglobin trigger for all patients should not be used as an approach. We have to consider all important physiologic and surgical factors before transfusing blood. When appropriate, use other blood conservation methods like intraoperative or postoperative blood recovery, acute normovolumic hemodilution, and measures to decrease blood loss during surgery by deliberate hypertension or using pharmacological drugs like tranexamic acid. So in a summary, if you see in acute anemia, any surgical hemorrhage, a transfusion trigger of less than 8 should be acceptable unless and until patient shows any presence of end organ symptoms like chest pain or intractable hypotension or increased lactate, which shows that the patient has moved from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, things like that. Traumatic hemorrhage, you can wait. Hemorrhagic shock, if you have a sign of inadequate oxygen delivery, immediately transfuse, even at higher blood hemoglobin. Critically ill patients, you can wait up to 7, or if there is a presence of any symptoms of ischemia, like cerebral ischemia, cardiac ischemia, you have to transfuse it. But in early sepsis with inadequate oxygen delivery, if you find such patients like mixed venous oxygen saturation of less than 65%, or lactates of more than 4 or 5, then even at 9 grams, you have to start transfusing. In late sepsis, you can wait up to 7 grams. So the ideal crux is you wait till 7 to 9 grams. If it goes less than 7, then you give blood, and you have to assess the clinical situation completely, not just go behind the hemoglobin value. So next component is FFP. It contains clotting factors, antibodies suspended in the plasma. It is stored at minus 20 degrees. You get at least 30 to 30 minutes after you order because of thawing process. It is mainly used for volume expansion and coagulation correction. I know a lot of senior people used to use it for volume expansion in pediatrics. And correction of coagulopathy whenever the INR is more than 2 in the absence of heparin. So you can transfuse FFP whenever you have coagulation deficiencies and you do not have the coagulation studies quickly. This occurs mostly in polytrauma case when you have a massive transfusion protocol. And replacement of known coagulation factors, that is specific coagulation factors if you want to give, and reversal of warfarin in urgent basis, then you need to use FFP. Complications of FFP, it is transfusion-related acute lung injury, then transfusion-associated circulatory overload or anaphylaxis reaction. We'll see about it later. Platelet concentrate, it is pooled from 4 to 6 donors, or you can get it through apheresis from a single donor. It is stored at room temperature for 5 to 7 days by a gentle agitation. It is an important source of bacterial infection in the component therapy. So it is always tested for bacterial presence. So prophylactically, you can use for patients who have who undergo chemotherapy with more who require at least 1 lakh platelet count. Peri-procedural to do a bone marrow biopsy or lumbar puncture, you need to aim at least 2 to 3 lakh count. And a neurosurgery patient, you should have a platelet count of at least 1 lakh. Active bleeding patient with a severe thrombocytopenia who shows only clinical signs of bleeding, and those who have less than 20,000 should be transfused with platelets. And low platelet count of less than 20 who do not have any clinical bleeding, we should wait to transfuse platelet. It shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. Just you see a 10,000 platelet, then you transfuse. No, you look for signs of bleeding. If there is no signs of any overt bleeding, then you can wait to transfuse. So it should be ABO compatible platelet transfusion is recommended, but even ABO incompatible transfusion, because of want of supply, achieves adequate hemostasis. 1 unit raises approximately by 7 to 10,000 counts. Factors for reduced platelet lifetime after transfusion is mainly a splenomegaly patient. He can destroy the platelets. A previous sensitization can destroy the platelet. The antibodies who sensitize, a patient who's been already sensitized with the antibody, previous exposure to platelets can destroy the platelets. Fever, sepsis, and active bleeding can consume platelet to a large extent. Cryoprecipitate is a precipitate after thawing the FFP. These are the factors which is available in the cryoprecipitate. And you have to give it with a filter, and it has to be transfused within 6 hours of thawing. Any fibrinogen of less than 80 to 100 milligram per deciliter who is experiencing excessive bleeding must receive cryo. Obstetric patient have a higher or lower threshold. Means even at 150 milligram per deciliter fibrinogen, try to give cryoprecipitate early. Okay, and in massive transfusion, definitely cryo is indicated, and other specific diseases like von Willebrand disease, cryo is indicated. Fresh whole blood is coming again. It is revisiting world. Does anyone use in modern world? Yes, in my hospital, cardiothoracic team uses fresh whole blood, and they are very comfortable with using fresh blood. They say that less cost is required and collection is very easy. Separation is not required, and they can store it up to 35 days if they cool it to 1 to 6 degrees. But fresh blood is always fresh. It is less than 8 hours of collection, and it is maintained at 22 degrees. It gives a better platelet function and a superior coagulation factors of more than 65% of them work well. Changes in the stored blood, which we saw, fresh blood should be given as much as possible. There is no difference in mortality, but may increase morbidity. Red cell storage lesions are, which we saw, there are a lot of acidosis, and 2,3-DPG reduces, hemolysis can occur, which can lead to plasma hemoglobin. So we all know the changes in the oxygen transport mainly because of 2,3-DPG reduction. Once it reduces in the stored blood, the P50 reduces, the oxygen dissociation curve is shifted to left, the oxygen affinity to the hemoglobin increases. And when this blood goes to the tissue, you require more hypoxic condition to dissociate the oxygen. So there's a high chances for having tissue hypoxia when you transfuse more or older blood cells given to patient than a recent RBCs. So try to give younger RBCs to avoid tissue hypoxia. But after 3 days of transfusion, the amount of 2,3-DPG in the red blood transfused red blood cell is restored to normal. And inosine is something which has been on trial. If it is added before giving, it can restore the 2,3-DPG levels in the PRBCs. So this is the classic hemorrhage classification, class 1 to 4. We all know the percentage of blood loss, 15%, 15 to 30, 30 to 40, and more than 40. But I want to concentrate, there are a lot of factors, a lot of things in the clutter. I want to declutter it on these 3 values. Whenever you see any patient whose heart rate is more than 100, whenever you see the diastolic pressure closer to systolic pressure, that is reduced pulse pressure, and that is the patient who is going to succumb and who can be saved by you, just by a simple administration of crystalloid, you can save him from getting into class 3 hemorrhage. So your action will be a game changer in such patients, and you can save many lives. So look for sympathetic activity, which is leading to more heart rate, increased heart rate, and increased diastolic blood pressure. So any patient who is in group 4 will naturally be pushed to get massive transfusion. So by definition, we all know the definition of massive transfusion. Anybody who's receiving more than 10 RBCs units in 1 day, or anybody who's receiving more than 4 RBCs in 1 hour, more than 50% replacement of total blood volume in 3 hours, or more than 150 ml per minute loss. All these 3 definition suits us more than the first one. In pediatric, same. It is more than 100% total blood volume transfused within 24 hours. Transfusion support to replace ongoing hemorrhage of more than 10% of total blood volume. replacement of more than 50% of total blood volume by blood products within 3 hours. So again, whole blood component therapy paradigm change is being revisited in massive transfusion protocols. The major scenarios are major polytrauma, OG bleed, massive GI bleed, and surgical bleed intraoperatively. It is a complex interactive communication loop between anesthesiologist or a trauma consultant, blood bank officer. Laboratory should come out with results as quickly as possible. We need supportive staffs like nurses and runners to support us to bring blood and blood products, and institute specific guidelines should be developed. And it's the resuscitation, the complete lab work, and the damage control surgery goes hand in hand. The main aim is to avoid lethal triad of death, that is acidosis, coagulopathy, and hypothermia. Suppose a patient starts hemorrhaging, he goes into hypotension. Once the patient is in hypotension, we start resuscitating the patient with crystalloids. If you do resuscitation with crystalloids or colloids, there are a lot of hemodilution occurring, and there is a dilutional coagulopathy leading to more hemorrhage, and the crystalloid which we give is usually cold, that will lead to hypothermia. Hypothermia again reduces the function of the plasma clotting factors, which will lead to hemorrhage. So this vicious cycle leads to complication, massive transfusion. So I want you to concentrate on this part, that is, if there is a hypotension that leads to thrombin, that is thrombomodulin expression is increased in the endothelium, that will activate the platelets and consume platelets. Once they go to that phase of consumption coagulopathy, that lead to massive transfusion because the coagulopathy will be perpetuated and the cycle is kept going. So steps of massive transfusion protocol: identify the patients who are at risk, who require massive transfusion, and initiate and alert all necessary people. Activate institution MTP protocol. Optimize intrinsic coagulation by avoiding hypothermia. Use blood warmers and fluid warmers if possible. And early administration of tranexamic acid of 1 gram over 10 minutes and 1 gram after 8 hours should be employed. Try to give 1:1:1 ratio or 1:1:2 ratio to avoid dilutional coagulopathy and further bleeding. So early usage of fresh frozen plasma and platelets in massive transfusion protocol is advised. If possible, use cryoprecipitate or fibrinogen concentrate much early to avoid mortality. So you have to recheck with a lab complete blood counts, recheck INR PTT, check for fibrinogen, achieve at least 100 milligram per deciliter. If it is an obstetric hemorrhage, achieve at least 150 milligram per deciliter. Look for frequent ABGs to avoid acidosis. Look for creatinine level because they may present with acute renal failure. And always check for two important ions, calcium and magnesium, because in massive transfusion, if you give more and more of RBCs, calcium may citrate toxicity can occur, leading to hypocalcemia and hypomagnesemia. And you should have adequate protocol to stop MTP also. Okay. So emergency transfusion, there are two approaches, that is O negative uncross-match PRBCs alone should be used. Don't use whole blood in this scenario because antibodies will be there in the plasma. If you use only PRBC, O negative PRBCs, then it doesn't cause any hemolysis. And if you have time, then at least do O negative partially cross-matched RBCs. At least they will look for ABO-RH compatibility and antibody compatibility. After 2 to 4 units, send blood sample for presence of incompatibility to transfuse type-specific blood. There are many protocols followed by institutional blood banks. So you should get your own institution protocol from your blood bank. So damage control resuscitation, it is you allow hypotension at least to around 90 to 100 systolic blood pressure. Hemostatic resuscitation, give tranexamic acid, platelets and FFPs early in the resuscitation, and at the same time take him up for the damage control surgery. In this situation, anatomical repair is not the aim. Physiological and biochemical restoration is the aim. Anatomical repair can occur after a few days. So the damage control resuscitation and damage control surgery goes hand in hand. So the two studies, PROMPT and the proper study, want of time I'll rush through. It is done by the same fellow. Lead investigator is John Holcomb, and he compared the 1:1:1 and 1:1:2. In this initial study, prompt study, he said that early usage of plasma and platelets gives mortality benefit. Then he compared 1:1:1 and 1:1:2 ratio to check which is better. And he found that 1:1:1 is safer and it is effective in reducing bleeding complications. So if ever you want to give, the bottom line is you have to transfuse with 1:1:1 transfusion. Complications of massive transfusion, we know that citrate toxicity, hyperkalemia, metabolic acidosis, hypothermia, coagulopathy, TRALI, and TACO. Adverse reactions, you have both acute and delayed. Both it could be immune mediated or non-immune mediated. So you have acute hemolytic transfusion reaction mainly because of antibody reaction to the ABO incompatibility. This is hugely reduced with good blood bank strategies. Febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, it is mainly presenting as fever, rigors, and chills. It is mainly because of the WBCs present in the PRBC. So once you stop blood transfusion, you give paracetamol and give pethidine to reduce the rigors. Rigors is not achieved by treating with paracetamol alone. Urticaria is a very minimal, a very minor complication. Just wait for some stop transfusion, give some antihistaminics, and then restart. Anaphylaxis is a deadly complication. You need anaphylaxis protocol. TRALI is again immune-mediated adverse reaction which can occur within 6 hours of transfusion. Okay, it is a non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. And non-immune mediated is transfusion-related sepsis, mainly seen with platelet transfusion. So look for any bacterial presence in the blood and the platelet which you have transfused. In the blood bank, they use something called diversion method, where they initially draw the blood from the patient and let it out. First 15 to 20 ml is let out. And then the remaining blood is taken to the bag collection. So in that way, they have reduced it by 70% sepsis, which is related to transfusion. And non-immune hemolysis is mainly mechanical problem where the blood cells are deformed, and whenever it is transfused in a day or two, they get hemolyzed. TACO is transfusion-associated circulatory overload. The delayed, again, you have immune and non-immune mediated reactions. Alloimmunization, this is one group where patients who are frequently exposed to blood transfusion like sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, or thrombocytopenic patients, they get allo antibodies. So if you wait for some time without any transfusion, the antibodies can be minimized. Then transfusion-associated immunomodulation. This is very important because any cancer surgeries, if you indiscriminately use blood transfusion, that can lead to cancer recurrence also. So try to minimize transfusion in cancer surgery. The deadliest is transfusion-associated graft versus host disease, where in an immunocompromised patient, if you give blood transfusion, this can go and destroy the host, that is the recipient, and it can lead to catastrophe. And iron overload due to repeated transfusion can lead to hemocitosis. So if you see, with good blood bank practices, the infectious complications are minimized to a large extent. And a non-infectious complication like alloantibody development, or febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, or TACO, or delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction, or TRALI, are more common than ABO incompatibility or infectious reactions. This is a word about blood management, patient blood management. We are in the last few minutes of the lecture. Understand the rationale of transfusion, whether you have to rule out whether he is a Jehovah's Witness, a rare antibody, or a rare blood group, and there is no transfusion ability in your hospital. Sorry. Take consent for Jehovah's Witness to use cryo or cell salvage systems. Diagnose anemia, treat them with treat the anemia preoperatively using IV ion or oral ion or erythropoietin. Hold antiplatelets before surgery. Intraoperatively minimize bleeding by using local hemostatic agents by surgeons or using antifibrinolytics like tranexamic acid. Try to use intraoperative self-salvage system if it is acceptable. If it is a non-malignant surgeries, you can always use. Acute normovolemic hemodilution, if acceptable, you can practice. Artificial O2 carriers, I do not know how far it is freely available in India. Post-operatively reduce blood draws and continue to treat anemia post-operatively, so that you can use these methods, a concentrated multiple approach, multi-pronged approach to reduce blood transfusion. And this effort should continue from preoperative, intraoperative, and postoperative care. So take home message, blood transfusion is not free of complication. Don't take it lightly. Use it judiciously. Use restrictive versus liberal transfusion approach. So wait till 7 gram hemoglobin unless and until there is no signs of any ischemic changes or any oxygen delivery problem in the patient. Isolated hemoglobin value is of less importance, and the overall clinical condition is more valuable than isolated hemoglobin value. Treat and manage anemia from preoperatively approximately 4 weeks onwards. Use oral or IV iron or use erythropoietin if needed. Intraoperative measures to reduce transfusion like hypotensive anesthesia or tranexamic acid should be encouraged. Early use of FFPs, platelets, and cryoprecipitates should be encouraged in massive bleeding other than giving PRBCs. Develop your own massive transfusion protocol in your institute to department specific, and damage control resuscitation should continue hand in hand with damage control surgery. If you see, the Chennai arterial roads were clogged with vehicles in the March 2020 or February 2020 with a lot of transfusions going on. And what we need is less transfusion and traffic-free roads like this, where we can give a Mother Earth a green earth, so that we don't transfuse much and reduce transfusion to a large extent and reduce adverse reactions, which is known or unknown to us, and patient may suffer because of our action. And we don't require less than 10 micron coronavirus to teach us something to discipline ourselves. And I think as an anesthesiologist, it is our prime duty to protect our patient, not only during the surgery, and also after the surgery. Thank you very much.